You know it? Come on, tell us. Who? It's got to be horse racing. Yes, I mean, logically speaking, it can only be horse racing.
My name is Jane Dorotik. I spent 20 years in prison for a crime I did not commit. I thought truth and justice was at the front of everything. And it certainly has not been in my case. I wish I just knew what really happened. I wish there was some way to piece it together, somebody to come forward with the truth.
On February 13, 2000, Jane and Bob Dorotik are living together in North San Diego.
He said he was going out for a jog. That was it. That was the last I talked to him.
She reports her husband missing. There was a search for him as a missing person. The next day, he was found in a location 2 or 3 miles away from their home.
And I stopped about right here. I could see the body, and I said, "This is Mr. Dorotik."
He was found to have blunt force trauma to his head. He was found to have injuries consistent with strangulation.
It was obvious to me that it was a homicide.
They found Bob's blood in his bedroom. The detectives decided, because they saw some blood, that they were in the crime scene, and that Jane was the only one with access to that bedroom and to Bob.
There was only one person that could have done this to Mr. Dorotik, and that was his wife, Jane Dorotik.
He said, "You're under arrest." I was like, what? I would never hurt my husband.
Police say circumstantial and blood evidence links Jane Dorotik to her husband's murder.
The bedroom was not a crime scene.
I don't doubt that this occurred at the home, and I don't doubt that she's involved.
There was blood on the comforter. There was blood on the pillow sham. There was blood on the headboard.
When you have a home that's a working ranch, you're gonna find blood around.
It's just problem on top of problem on top of problem.
I would declare this crime scene very contaminated.
They focused on one person and turn a blind eye to anything else.
Jane Dorotik chose murder over divorce.
It felt like a nightmare, and I kept saying, when am I going to wake up?
Do you believe that Jane Dorotik got a fair trial?
No, I don't.
I'm in no position to say who did what. I don't have a crystal ball to tell you what happened to that man.
What do you believe happened to Bob?
I believe Bob somehow fell into some kind of situation. I don't know. I lost my husband, and then I lost my freedom.
Jane, how would you describe what the last 22 years have been like for you?
It's been torturous in many ways. I suppose many moments when I thought, how do I keep going? I always used to say this is the most peaceful place on the face of the earth. Nothing feels peaceful anymore.
When we first met Jane Dorotik in 2000,
the stress of all of it on everyone has been incredible.
the life she had once found so serene in the foothills outside of San Diego, a life she had shared with her husband Bob, had taken an unimaginable turn.
How can this be? How can this happen? Surely I'll wake up and it's a dream.
Jane had become the prime suspect in Bob's murder. Authorities believe that she viciously attacked him in their home.
I certainly didn't do this. I loved my husband.
Jane, 53 years old at the time, and Bob, 55, shared more than half their lives together.
I was 23 when we were married. Bob was a wonderful, loving, creative person.
And welcome everyone here, those who've been here before and those who haven't.
Bob spent most of his career as an engineer. Jane worked as a nurse and later as an executive in the healthcare industry. The couple raised 3 children, Alex, Claire, and Nick.
The family has always been incredibly important to both of us.
Also important to Jane were their horses. While Jane's passion was breeding and riding,
I'm having a good old time here.
Bob was an avid jogger, and that, says Jane, is the last image she has of her husband.
Bob was sitting actually in this chair, facing the TV.
Although Jane was under suspicion, she allowed us into her home.
He said he was going out for a jog, and he was actually had his jogging suit on, was tying his shoes. That was the last I talked to him.
It was around 1 p.m. on February 13, 2000, when Jane says Bob left to go for that run. As hours passed without any word from him, Jane says she grew concerned.
It was beginning to get dark. I decided to go out and look.
This is the route Jane says she took to search for Bob, driving up and down the hill where he sometimes ran. By 7:45 p.m., Jane's concern turned to fear.
I said, enough, this is enough, something is wrong. And that's when I made the call to the sheriff's department.
My first thought that night was maybe this man had a heart attack and fell down the embankment along Lake Wolford Road.
As Deputy James Blackman and others from the San Diego County Sheriff's Department searched for Bob, concerned friends and family gathered at the Dorotik house.
The minute I saw my mom's face, I knew right away something terrible had happened.
The Dorotik's daughter, Claire, 24 at the time, had spent the weekend visiting her aunt and returned home to a distraught Jane.
She was freaked out. She was scared, she was nervous, she was crying.
It was a horrifying feeling that got more and more horrifying when he wasn't found.
And then in the pre-dawn hours of February 14th, Deputy Blackman turned into this driveway several miles from the Dorotik home and noticed a body off the road.
At this point, I could see the shirt, the pants, and he was laying on his back.
From Jane's description, he immediately knew it was Bob Dorotik.
I got there a little after 7 in the morning.
San Diego County Sheriff's Detective Rick Empson was called to the scene.
There was no evidence of any type of vehicle accident.
The evidence Empson did find suggested something else.
I could see that he had blood on his face. There was blood near the back of his head. And I could see that there was a rope around his neck.
Bob Dorotik had been bludgeoned and strangled. The one-time missing person case had turned into a homicide investigation.
Is there anybody you could think who would want to see your husband dead?
Nobody. Nobody.
As law enforcement asked Jane questions about Bob, she let them into her home.
Come in, search, look for anything.
Detective Empson noticed a piece of rope hanging from the porch that caught his attention, thinking he had just seen something similar on Bob Dorotik.
It appeared to be the exact same type of rope that was found around his neck. The sliding glass door going into the master bedroom.
And when investigators got to Bob and Jane's bedroom, they found something more troubling. They believed they were looking at blood spatter.
There was no question in our mind that this assault occurred in the master bedroom.
They documented their findings in this diagram, taking photos along the way of what they believed to be blood on various items in the bedroom and of what appeared to be a large blood stain on the underside of the mattress.
I do know when Bob had a nosebleed, he made a comment about getting some blood on the mattress.
Jane says there was a logical explanation for some of the other blood, too. They had dogs who were injured and had bled.
This little dog had an abscess on her cheek that was openly draining at the time, and little drops of blood we'd find as she sat on the couch. The carpet pieces are what the detectives removed, feeling that there was blood on the carpet.
The spots of blood investigators said they found all over the bedroom surprised Jane.
Do you have any other explanation of how that blood spatter could have gotten there?
Not really.
On the ceiling, on the window, on the walls?
No.
Adding to authorities' suspicions was this bloody syringe found in the bathroom garbage. Jane told us she used it to medicate her horses.
I know that I give the horses shots all the time. If you go look in my fridge right now, you'll find horse syringes.
Investigators theorize that Jane hit her husband with an object in the bedroom and strangled him. She then dressed him in his jogging suit, put him in their truck, and dumped him along the side of the road where his body was found.
Why do they believe you killed your husband?
You know, I guess I've been through that one a billion times. I don't know.
But investigators thought they knew, believing the motive was money and escaping a troubled marriage. Jane was the main breadwinner, and they learned the couple had split up for a year in 1997.
I don't make any apologies for the fact that we had rough times, but that doesn't change the fact that we loved each other.
And that love, says Jane, is why they reconciled. They have been back living together as a couple for a year and a half before Bob was killed.
I really think the separation caused us to really regroup and think about what was important.
They were getting along better than they ever had in the past. I was living there. I can tell you that.
But law enforcement was unmoved, and 3 days after Bob Dorotik's body was found, Jane was arrested and charged with first-degree murder.
I know I didn't do this. I know there's a killer out there, but how am I going to clear myself?
She's baffled because I don't think she knows what happened.
Released on bail, Jane started preparing her defense, hiring attorney Carrie Steigerwalt.
She knows that she's placed as the killer, and she's not the killer.
And at trial, Jane's attorney would present a surprise suspect who he felt was responsible for Bob Dorotik's murder.
I know that I'm innocent, but I don't have any more faith in the legal system. I believe I could be convicted for something that I didn't do, and that's very scary.
While Jane worried about her outcome at trial, Claire Dorotik was much more confident about her mother's chances.
My mom could not have done this crime. She didn't have the motive, and she didn't have the opportunity.
But when the case went to trial in 2001, a year after the murder, prosecutor Bonnie Howard Regan described the Dorotik's marriage as seriously troubled and told jurors that Jane didn't want to pay Bob alimony in a divorce.
Bob Dorotik never went jogging, and he never left that residence alive.
According to the state, Bob had actually been killed Saturday night, nearly a day before Jane reported him missing. The autopsy performed by Dr. Christopher Swalwell showed undigested food consistent with what Jane said they had for dinner that night.
Are you able to give us an estimate of how long after Mr. Dorotik ate, how long after that he was killed?
Yes, it was very shortly after he ate. I would say it was probably within a couple of hours.
And he wasn't killed on the side of the road, the prosecutor said. There wasn't enough blood there. Instead, she said Bob's blood was all over the bedroom. Lead detective Rick Empson testified he had asked Jane to explain that.
She'd indicated initially that she had a dog that had been bleeding, and then indicated that approximately a week prior, Bob had a bloody nose over in the corner by the stove, and that Bob had cleaned it up.
There was evidence someone cleaned the bedroom. The carpet next to the potbelly stove and tiled floor was wet and had bloodstains underneath.
Did any of the blood from his nosebleed go on the carpet?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where?
Mm-hmm. Right next to the tile, because I'm the one that helped him clean it.
Authorities dismissed Jane's explanations. Their theory was that Jane hit Bob in the head in their bedroom with an object while he was lying in bed, although they never identified or found any weapon. Charles Merritt, a criminalist and bloodstain pattern analyst for the San Diego County Sheriff's Crime Lab, recounted 20 locations where he saw bloodstains.
On one of the pillows, on a lamp, this particular nightstand, on the potbelly stove, was on the ceiling itself, and then on the underside of the mattress.
The jury was also shown this evidence of tire tracks found near Bob's body. The state's expert, Anthony DiMaria, said he matched the 3 different types of tires on Dorotik's truck.
Are you saying the measurements taken at the scene were equal to the measurements taken off the actual vehicle?
Yes.
The most telling evidence connecting Jane to the murder, according to the prosecutor, was that syringe found in the bathroom. It had traces of a horse tranquilizer inside, and even though there was no evidence that Bob had been injected with anything, it had Bob's blood and a bloody fingerprint on it.
The evidence will show that the fingerprint on this syringe was Jane Dorotik's.
Can you explain that?
I can't really explain it other than I know that I helped Bob clean up a nosebleed. And if that's the same time when I took the syringes and threw them in the trash, and there was some blood on my hand, that could have made that happen.
But perhaps the most powerful witnesses were the Dorotik's 2 sons, Nick and Alex. They both testified against their mother.
Did you say anything specifically about the syringe?
Well, I asked her how it got there and what it was doing there.
And what was your mother's response?
She said that her biggest fear in all of this was that that us family members would start questioning her.
Your mother always settled things logically? Tried to?
No.
You wouldn't agree with that statement?
Nope.
It would be my mom basically saying, this is what you have to accept. And then my dad would either accept it or there would be threats of divorce or something. That's what I remember from growing up.
Jane's attorneys, Carrie Steigerwald and Cole Casey, admitted it was a big blow.
Would you say that's been the most damaging testimony?
Yeah. It's not what they said, it's the fact that they were there testifying for the prosecution.
When it came time for the defense to present its case, Steigerwald actually agreed with the prosecution on a major point, that the murder took place in the bedroom. But he had a jaw-dropping alternative suspect, Claire Dorotik.
Ladies and gentlemen, Claire hated her father.
He claimed Claire, an avid horsewoman, hated her father because he threatened to sell the animals she loved and suggested that she was capable of murder.
That's what Claire is. A hot-tempered, explosive individual.
It was a risky strategy that Jane reluctantly agreed to.
All I can do is trust what Carrie says is the best way to go.
Are you at all concerned that the jury will wonder about a woman who would allow herself to be defended by pointing the finger at her daughter? Could that work against the two of you?
It may, I don't know. I think it is the most viable defense, and I think it's supported by the best evidence.
Steigerwald insisted Jane wasn't physically able to commit the murder, but Claire was.
She runs marathons, and she's a personal trainer. She is as fit a woman as you will see at the age of 24.
But remember, Claire and her aunt said they were together 2 hours away.
They call the aunt. That's the extent of the investigation on the alibi of Claire Dorotik.
Would Miss Claire Dorotik please step forward?
That alibi is nonsense.
You are going to assert your Fifth Amendment rights? Correct.
The jurors never heard from Claire or Jane, who chose not to testify. But they did hear from a woman who said she thought she saw Bob the day he disappeared, sitting between 2 men in a black pickup truck, not far from where his body was found.
Who killed Robert Dorotik? Was it Claire Dorotik Or, ladies and gentlemen, was it someone else?
In his closing argument, Steigerwald accused investigators of dismissing witnesses like that woman and focusing only on Jane.
The prosecution had focused on one person, and that's not the way to conduct an investigation. It's not the way to run a case.
Jane Dorotik and Bob Dorotik were the only two people in that home that weekend.
Bonnie Howard Regan says there's no need to investigate further when you have sufficient evidence.
They searched that bedroom and they saw all the blood and they knew that was the crime scene. What more investigation do they need to do?
It took the jury 4 days to return a verdict.
We, the jury, in the above titled cause, find the defendant, Jane Marguerite Dorotik, guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree in violation of Penal Code Section 1.
Did Jane Dorotik get a fair trial?
No. No. Because fairness means that you're presenting things accurately, and it appears like it was not done accurately.
Juror number 8? Yes. Juror number 9?
Yes.
Juror number 10?
Yes.
Go behind the scenes with the 48 Hours Post-Mortem podcast.
It almost didn't register for a minute. It's like, no, this can't be. I was so certain that I was walking out. I thought they would see the truth.
Jane Dorotik never imagined she'd be found guilty.
It's hard to keep going.
At the time of her conviction for the murder of her husband, she was 54 years old and sentenced to 25 years to life.
I mean, I can't see my way clear to a life in prison. I just can't see it.
Determined to prove the jury got it wrong, Jane became her own advocate, working on her case for many years. We spoke with Jane again 2 decades later about her efforts.
All through my prison journey, I continued to write all innocence projects I could think of, asking for help. At the same time, realized that I had to fight for myself.
Jane filed motions from prison, citing such issues as insufficient evidence and ineffective assistance of counsel.
I would describe my defense as limited and inadequate.
In her filings, Jane indicated that she wanted to testify at her trial, but had left that decision up to her attorney, and that had she testified, she could have explained Bob's stomach contents, stating that he sometimes ate leftovers from the previous night. She also described her attorney's alternate suspect theory, pointing to her daughter Claire as the killer, as absurd.
Do you believe that your daughter Claire had anything to do with the death of her dad?
Absolutely, unequivocally not. And my defense attorney, everybody knew she was away for that weekend.
In regard to that defense strategy, Claire later wrote in a book, "How could I be angry at my mother when all I did was worry about her?" Jane's lawyer, whom we interviewed at the time of her trial, did not speak with us again.
That was the worst strategy of my life, ever. I said to my attorney, if anything happens to Claire, I'm going to stand up and say I did it.
In her filings, Jane also questioned why her defense attorney accepted the bad forensics pointing to the bedroom as the murder scene, rather than presenting other scenarios as to where and how Bob Dorotik could have been murdered.
Did the defense too easily accept the bedroom as a crime scene?
That is a very legitimate argument.
CBS News consultant Matthew Troiano, a former prosecutor and current defense attorney, was not involved in the Dorotik case, but he reviewed some of the court documents at our request.
The defense made a strategic decision. Are we going to dispute that a crime happened in this location, or are we essentially going to concede that it happened there and then come up with a different narrative of how it happened there? And they chose the latter.
And that decision, Troiano says, likely led the defense to point the finger at Claire for the murder.
They had to blame somebody else for something that happened in a specific location. And they, at least as it relates to the daughter, you know, went back to her having some disagreement with her father about something, and it was a risk.
Have you ever seen that kind of defense?
You don't see it. I mean, you could happen when there are clear facts and evidence to support it, but when there are none, that's a showstopper.
And in fact, Claire was never charged with any wrongdoing in connection to her father's murder. The defense accepting the bedroom as the murder scene is especially puzzling to Troiano, as there were reports from several eyewitnesses who said they saw a man jogging that day, accounts consistent with Jane's depiction of events, not the prosecution's.
That's critical evidence.
And all of that was really not pursued, and I didn't know of all of the witnesses. Had there been a thorough investigation initially, all of that would have come out.
Through the years in filings, Jane raised problems with the entire case against her, arguing that authorities focused on her from the very beginning of the investigation and failed to follow other investigative leads. But motion after motion was denied. And regarding Jane's ineffective counsel claims, the judge rejected them all, ruling that her attorney's performance was not deficient and that his actions had not affected the outcome of the case.
There were many moments where I doubted, when is this ever going to turn around? Many, many moments.
Still, Jane didn't give up. She continued looking for new evidence to clear her, especially as DNA testing became more advanced. In 2012, she filed a petition for DNA testing of that rope found around Bob's neck and other items, like Bob's fingernail clippings, which had been saved but never tested. And in 2015, the motion was granted.
Is that unusual that she finally even got testing based on her filing motions on her own?
Yes, it's very atypical.
It was at this time that Jane finally got the attention of a wrongful conviction group, Loyola Law School's Project for the Innocent.
I get this wonderful letter from Loyola saying, you've contacted us and we're interested in your case. And after that, Loyola took over, got the testing done.
And what that testing revealed, as well as a fresh examination of other evidence, would change the course of the case.
That's really what flips the script to say that there's more here. This is more than just an inadequate investigation. There is a different narrative that's running through these test results. There is physical evidence that another person could be involved. When you talk about the evidence in this case, the subsequent testing reveals that you might have a different explanation for things that really shed light on what may have happened here.
Jane Dorotik spent years behind bars asking for a new examination of the evidence used to convict her of her husband Bob's murder. Now, working with a team from Loyola Project for the Innocent, the court allowed them to have new DNA testing on items such as the rope found around Bob Dorotik's neck, his fingernails, and clothing. Appeal filings state that foreign male DNA was found on several items.
The results of that, none of my DNA anywhere.
There is physical evidence from fingernail clippings, from a rope, from his clothing, that is foreign to Jane.
The team from Loyola Project for the Innocent declined to be interviewed. We asked Nathan Lentz, a professor of biology and forensic science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, who was not involved in the case, to review court documents about new evidence, such as the DNA on the rope.
While they didn't get a profile that would be good enough to search a database or even match to a suspect, they did get enough DNA that is not attributable to Bob or to Jane.
But while Jane and her team believed the results pointed to her innocence, the state came to a different conclusion, stating in filings the DNA obtained was too low level to make any reliable interpretation. Lentz agrees the DNA levels were low, but he believes it was enough to exclude Jane, and that the absence of Jane's DNA on the rope as well as under Bob's fingernails or on his clothing is significant.
With the theory of crime that they presented, you would expect a lot of Jane's DNA on Bob, and if she had moved his body, you know, there's a lot of DNA transfer that might have taken place there. That wasn't found.
The appellate team also reviewed the bedroom blood evidence the prosecutor told the jury was fully tested and was Bob's.
Now, the evidence will show that all this blood that has been described to you, the observations made in this bedroom, that it was all sent out for DNA analysis and it all came back to Bob Dorotik's blood.
But according to the appeal, not every single spot in the bedroom believed to be blood was tested. Instead, representative samples were tested.
There were cases where just simply one swab with a control was taken, and it was representative of a variety of spots. That's not good practice. It just invites misinterpretations.
When you're talking about blood spatter and you're trying to analyze how it got there, you need to do a fairly comprehensive test to be able to draw the conclusion that you're drawing.
But I think the prosecution could argue you can't afford to test, can you? Every single drop that looks like blood?
Right? But when you say we did everything, and that's not accurate, that's where the problem lies.
In fact, the appellate team says that several blood-like stains on items, including a pillow sham, the nightstand, a lampshade, turned out not to be blood. And there were those stains on the bedspread, which criminalist Charles Merritt pointed to at trial and described as Bob's blood.
Two of the actual stains circled by little red dots.
Jane's lawyers learned those particular spots were never tested at all, and due to improper storage, the bedspread could not be tested again.
So we don't know that it was blood at all.
The handling of the evidence over the course of the entire investigation was also raised on appeal.
This one is hard to even look at. You have an investigator who definitely should know better, handling murder evidence with his bare hands. In addition to obviously depositing his own DNA all around this crime scene, he's also risking transferring evidence from among the various spots that he's collecting.
And there's that syringe with Bob's blood and Jane's fingerprint found in the bathroom garbage, something the appellate team and Lentz thought could be explained.
And if you throw that syringe in the garbage can, Bob throws a bloody Kleenex in that garbage can, they could transfer. Transfer of DNA from one object to another in a trash can is not unexpected.
Lentz feels the fact that the syringe was even found in the garbage points fingers away from Jane.
If you're cleaning up after a murder, you won't leave the bloody syringe in the basket.
But the state stood by its original investigation, maintaining the bedroom was the murder scene, stating that the evidence still points to Jane Dorotik as the killer, and that the defense arguments are largely derived from speculation and misstatements of fact. Jane's appellate team, though, maintains the bedroom did not even look like a crime scene, something Lentz also believes.
There is not a consistent pattern to the evidence that indicates a violent bludgeoning that took place in that bedroom. If Bob were alive today and investigators had walked in his room, no one would say, oh, this looks like someone was murdered here.
If you just look at all of the pieces of evidence that Loyola was able to absolutely take apart, and yet we know what was told to the jury in the original conviction. So how can that happen?
As her attorneys reviewed evidence, Jane Dorotik in 2020 was temporarily and conditionally let out of prison due to COVID health concerns. The question now became, was the new evidence her lawyers were finding enough to make her release permanent?
What do you think about the new DNA test results? Chat now with Erin Moriarty on X.
In the summer of 2020, Jane Dorotik and her team hoped a court would overturn the jury's verdict, turning her temporary release from prison into lasting freedom.
What were their major points?
The testing that was done initially was insufficient. The way that that testing was presented to the jury was inaccurate. There were a number of different arguments that they made.
A hearing was scheduled, but then suddenly the state requested an unplanned virtual hearing.
The people are willing to concede petitioner's new evidence claim.
The prosecution admitted what Jane's lawyers had argued all along.
The DNA evidence as it exists now in 2020 is much different in quality and quantity than presented at trial in 2001.
That the new DNA test results, as well as issues with how the sheriff's crime lab handled evidence, cast doubt on the verdict. But what came next was even more unexpected. The state requested that Jane's murder conviction be overturned, and the judge agreed.
I'm going to grant the motion for the writ. Thank you, Your Honor.
I always believed that at some point the truth would come out.
But Jane's ordeal wasn't over. 3 months later, in another shocking move, the DA's office decided to retry her.
I don't think any of us thought that San Diego County would attempt to retry me, but they did.
The state believes that she did this, and they want to pursue it.
But in order to retry her, the prosecution first had to demonstrate to the judge that there was still enough evidence to prove Jane killed Bob, despite the new DNA results and the questions about the initial testing.
We are back on the record, all parties.
Then you have this battle in court. If you're conceding that there were problems, how are you going to do it again, essentially, with the same evidence?
It was astounding to sit in that courtroom and see what they try and put forward as actual evidence, and then also thrilling to see my team take it apart.
Do you solemnly state that the
Jane's attorneys questioned the credibility of several of the state's experts, including Charles Merritt of the Sheriff's Crime Lab. The judge ultimately ruled that the new trial could go ahead, but that some key evidence presented in her original trial would not be admissible, including those tire tracks near where Bob's body was found that were linked to Jane's truck.
You have a number of different trucks that could be consistent with those tire tracks. It's, in essence, kind of junk science-y.
In May 2022, just as jury selection was about to begin, the prosecution surprised everyone yet again.
Remain seated and come to order. This courtroom is now in session.
We go into court as the jury is assembled and ready to come into the courtroom Monday morning, and everything's changed.
We no longer feel that the evidence is sufficient to show proof beyond a reasonable doubt and convince 12 members of the jury, so we are requesting the court dismiss the charges at this time. Thank you.
Ms. Dorotik, you are free to go, and good luck to you.
It is overwhelming to realize that now I can determine my own future. It's something I've prayed for and hoped for.
After the hearing, Jane's attorneys spoke about her decades-long fight.
Jane's dignity in standing up and stoically fighting for her innocence against every risk and every threat. That's why this case got dismissed today, and as far as we're concerned, we're moving on.
The district attorney's office and sheriff's department declined to speak with 48 Hours. The case against Jane Dorotik was dismissed without prejudice, which means if new evidence surfaces, charges could be brought again someday.
But then doesn't that leave still a shadow over Jane Dorotik?
Oh, sure, it does. I mean, there's no question about it. From a practical perspective, do I think it's over? Yeah, I think it's over. But from a legal perspective, no.
Jane Dorotik is working to rebuild her life after spending nearly 2 decades in prison.
My entire family has been blown apart by this hurricane of events. It's been heartbreaking on so many levels.
Claire Dorotik did not respond to our request for comment, but Jane says they are still close. Her son Nick died in 2023. Alex Dorotik did not provide a comment to 48 Hours, but according to filings by the state, he remains convinced his mother killed his father.
Do you have hope that your family will come together at some point?
Of course I do. Of course I have hope.
Jane also has hope that she could make a difference in other people's lives as she works with advocacy groups that help incarcerated women.
To me, it's not just about my story. And yes, we can all sit here and say, this is so horrendous, and how did this happen to this woman? But unless we look systemically, how many others are we going to find? And to me, that's critically important.
Many unanswered questions about this case remain, including, perhaps, the most important one.
What happened here? We don't know what happened to Bob Dorotik. Where's justice for Bob? Where's justice for Robert Dorotik?
Need more time with 48 Hours? Go deep behind every true crime episode with first-hand accounts from 48 Hours Investigations.
Were you at all prepared for what happened in this case?
Shock is the word that comes to mind.
Get inside the twists and turns and get in on the case. Listen to Post-mortem from 48 Hours, now available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anne Marie Green. Welcome to Postmortem. This week, we are delving into the murder of Bob Dorotik and the wrongful conviction of his wife, Jane. She spent nearly 2 decades in prison trying to prove her innocence. It's really an emotional roller coaster watching this hour. Joining me to discuss this incredible story are 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty and producer Ruth Chenetz. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
I love this case because I think it's a great cautionary tale, and every defense attorney should be paying attention to this case.
So true. So listen, before we get into it, Ruth, I want you to give our listeners a bit of a recap of this case.
So Jane and Bob Dorotik were married. They had 3 grown children, and they lived in, at the time, probably considered a rural area outside of San Diego, and they had a ranch and horses, and Bob was a big runner. So Jane says the last time she saw Bob was around 1 p.m. on February 13th, 2000. And she says Bob left the house to go for a run, and she grew concerned when hours passed and he still hadn't returned. So later that evening at 7:45 p.m., she decides, I'm really worried, and makes a call to the sheriff's department to report that he was missing. And they start looking, and the next morning they found Bob's body on the side of a road just a few miles from his home. And they realized pretty quickly this wasn't a car accident. This wasn't that he died of natural causes, because he had blunt force trauma to his head and a rope around his neck. The sheriff's department talked to Jane, and in looking around at the bedroom, they feel that they're seeing lots of blood scattered throughout the bedroom and spots around the bedroom. So 3 days after his body is found, they arrest Bob's wife, Jane Dorotik, and charge her with first-degree murder.
When I was watching the first part of this episode, I couldn't help but to think, there seems to be some convincing evidence against Jane, like what seemed to be blood spatter found in the bedroom. Erin, over 2 decades that you have been reporting this case now, did you ever doubt Jane's innocence?
Well, pretty much. I always thought she was innocent. There's no question. I got on the story because actually I was working with a producer who had met her first and said, Erin, you've got to do this. When you meet her, she acts the way we would act if we had been accused of a crime we didn't do. She answers every question. And if she doesn't know it, she's honest and says, I don't know, this doesn't make sense. And this was a time when with 48 hours, we basically moved in with people. I mean, we were there for weeks and she would let us in the house. She would always sit down and talk with me. There was one time she wasn't as open with me during an interview and that made me a little worried, but I don't think I ever really changed in thinking there's just no way this woman did this.
I think that's such an interesting tidbit that you gave us, because as I was watching The Hour, I thought to myself, I bet you Jane likes Erin. I thought that, I thought she liked you as a person, and that's part of the reason she was being so open.
I liked her too.
Yeah.
But now remember, just put yourself back where I was. Here's this woman who says her husband went for a run, and then we're hearing from the police, and there's an arraignment that says there's blood in the bedroom, which is an absolute contradiction of her story. You're also thinking what to believe.
Also, one of the things is if this were happening today, an attorney would have been sitting next to Jane throughout the entire thing. I think people are more suspect today of the media and more suspicious. It's up to the individual person whether they want to let us in and how much time they want to spend and who be there. But it's just different these days.
Yeah. So let's get back to the blood stains in the Dorotik's bedroom and in their home. That was a big reason why authorities zeroed in on Jane. We learned that investigators identified 20 locations of different blood stains. Even if their home was a working ranch, that seems like a lot, right?
Well, yes. But now with benefit of hindsight, I realize that I shouldn't have accepted that quite so quickly. We did hear that there was blood spatter on the ceiling, but what had hit me was I saw a picture of a blood stain on a mattress. And what also struck me and worried me, in my heart was the fact that the mattress had been turned over. So that seemed incriminating.
And Jane had an explanation for some of the blood,
right?
Not all of it. She said in terms of the mattress that Bob had a nosebleed. And, if you think about it, are you going to want to lay on the side that's bloody or might you turn it over? And they had a dog who had bled. Two dogs. Yeah. I think one had one issue. One bled from the snout. One had I want to say like a hangnail, but whatever you call that in a dog. So she had explanations for some of it, but she also said to Erin, I can't explain all of it.
But then why wouldn't they have at least, say, tested to see if there's dog DNA there?
We have to go back. Remember, this is 2000. All right. We can't look at it through the lens of today where we know that testing is so much better. But again, I didn't know as a reporter to ask, what kind of tests have you done?
And what they ended up doing, and some of it was Bob's blood. But if they saw like 6 little dots in one spot, they might have tested 3 of those. You test representative samples, but then you can't say or shouldn't say everything was tested. And it all came back to Bob.
Let's talk about another bit of evidence. There was a syringe in the bathroom trash with traces of horse tranquilizer inside.
Which was normal.
Yeah, because it's a ranch, right? But was there any horse tranquilizer found in Bob's system?
No. And so that was one of those pieces of evidence that on the face of it looks like it's relevant, but it's really not.
Let's listen to a clip from the broadcast of Jane.
I can't really explain it other than I know that I helped Bob clean up a nosebleed. And if that's the same time when I took the syringes and threw them in the trash, and there was some blood on my hand, that could have made that happen.
The importance, I guess, of the syringe, it looked bad because there was blood on the syringe, Bob's blood, and you have a fingerprint on the syringe, and it was Jane's fingerprint. So it really wasn't relevant. It just looked bad.
Mm-hmm. And one thing where you think, well, that's weird that there's this bloody syringe in a garbage pail. When we spoke to another expert, Nathan Lentz, actually said in his mind that pointed fingers away from Jane, because if you're going to be cleaning up a crime scene, we all know criminals can do stupid things, but would you leave a bloody syringe in the trash?
Right. And then, so here's kind of the other aspect of what the prosecution believed, that Jane attacked her husband in the bedroom and then transported him in a truck to dump his body. I mean, there's a reason why there's a phrase sort of dead weight. I mean, people are heavy. People are much heavier than they look. So I did think, geez, that would be really hard.
I remember, and this was an issue for us, one of the reasons why I believed her. You know, she was probably my size, my height, and she had a bad back. And the idea, like you talk about dead weight, of not only getting her husband out of the bedroom, but getting him onto that truck seemed inconceivable. And the prosecution didn't seem to be troubled by that.
But was there any evidence of blood found in the truck?
When they tested initially, they found a very small stain in the wheel well of the truck that had Bob's DNA. But it's Bob's truck. It's a working ranch. It wasn't that there were puddles and pools of blood.
Yeah.
So was that significant? Hard to know.
Authorities arrest Jane, though, 3 days. 3 days after the murder. That seems really quick, because we've talked about some 48 hours episodes where, the suspect is walking around for months until they collect enough evidence. 3 days?
Well, it's too quick for really two reasons. One big one is they didn't even have all their test results back. So they're making basically this assumption and making it public and, saying this woman is accused of killing her husband. And then for the other reason why it was too early is you can't go back on it then. They haven't investigated the reports of seeing a man out there jogging. But how do you backtrack after you've already said, we have evidence, strong evidence to indicate this woman killed her husband, when you don't even have your test results?
Yeah. So then it's a year later, in 2001, a year after Bob's murder, and the case finally goes to trial. For me, what made this trial, particularly shocking was, of course, Jane's sons, who testify against their mother at trial. This is her son Alex on the stand being questioned by the defense.
Your mother always settled things logically? Tried to?
No.
You wouldn't agree with that statement?
Nope. It would be my mom basically saying, this is what you have to accept. And then my dad would either accept it or there would be threats of divorce or something. That's what I remember from growing up.
Okay, so he's describing, which is something that's not the happiest marriage, but anyone who's married knows that sometimes things ebb and flow. But, this must have broken Jane's heart.
And it did. It did. The idea that not one, but both sons testified against their mother at a murder trial is very, very damaging and was very difficult for her.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in terms of the prosecution, one of the things they're trying to explain to the jury is, the motive. And the motive was that the marriage was on the rocks and they didn't get along as great as people thought. So the sons provided, in their mind, I'm sure, like eyewitnesses to that fact.
Yeah, the prosecution told the jurors that this was a broken marriage. She was the primary breadwinner and she didn't want to pay alimony. And that was what the jury was told.
So you have the sons testifying against her. And then on the other hand, you have Jane's daughter, Claire. She remained convinced that her mother could not have committed this murder. Claire didn't testify at trial, but she gets pulled into the defense's argument in a really surprising way. Jane's attorney claims that Claire is the one that killed her father. How did Claire feel about this defense? It's risky.
Anne-Marie, I have to tell you, that decision on the part of the defense attorneys to try to save a mother by pointing to the daughter was shocking to me then and is shocking to me now and had to be devastating for Jane, realized there was absolutely no physical evidence to tie Claire to this murder.
And there was that alibi that Claire was at her aunt's house at the time Bob was murdered.
But it was an attempt to raise reasonable doubt in the mind of the jurors, like, well, maybe it wasn't the mother, maybe it was the daughter.
It was shocking. Claire later wrote in a book that she was so worried about her mother that she felt she didn't have a choice but to go along with it, that she was more worried than angry. And Jane subsequently told Erin that you think your defense lawyers know the best strategy. So she reluctantly went along with it. But Claire was never charged with any wrongdoing in regard to her father's murder.
Claire never talked to us about this as much as I would have loved to have heard. But in her book that Ruth had mentioned, she did describe how it was just kind of, put in her plate. She didn't have a say in it. No one went to her and said, how about, we point the finger. It was a done deal and she had to accept it. I can't even imagine being in the position of Jane, trying to save yourself by pointing at your daughter, number one, or being the daughter, knowing that your mother's life is on the line and you're going to be the other suspect. I can't imagine this. It's like Shakespearean.
You read my mind. I was actually thinking it's like a drama in mythology. It's just, it's all bad choices.
And it didn't save her.
And it did not save her.
It didn't save Jane.
So here's the thing. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't save her. The jury is not convinced. On June 12th, 2001, Jane was found guilty of first-degree murder, and then she's sentenced to 25 years to life. Erin, were you able to speak to Jane after the verdict? It must have felt like unreal to her.
And to me as well, I have to tell you, I will never forget that because I was not allowed to bring my producer in with me or a crew. And I remember leaving the car, going into the jail because she was still in a jail at that point. And Jane was Jane. Jane was still talking the way I'd always heard Jane. And I was like, I think this woman is innocent and she's going to spend the rest of her life in prison. And it was very disturbing.
All right, so when we come back, Jane's 22-year fight for justice from behind bars and the miraculous breakthrough in her case. Welcome back, everyone. So after Jane is sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, she becomes her own advocate, meticulously working on her case year after year. It is a daunting task. How did she do this?
She filed document after document, motion after motion, and everything would be turned down and she would keep going. And from the beginning, she also tried to get the attention of innocence groups, but that didn't immediately come. So she was like, okay, I have to do this on my own.
But I want to remind people, because I don't think people are aware, when you say she had to do it on her own, you're not entitled to an attorney after your very first post-conviction appeal. That's it. And so everyone, usually, unless they're wealthy, they have to do it on their own. Some people just give up. Jane did not. She never gave up.
So in prison, as you mentioned, she files motions, some of them claiming that she had ineffective assistance of counsel. She says that she originally wanted to testify at trial and that she disagreed with the defense's strategy to point the finger at her daughter, Claire. In your experience covering wrongful conviction cases, how successful are ineffective counsel claims?
Really, really tough. Very rarely. And in fact, in this case, too, Jane did not win that.
Right. And the judge said, well, we don't really think it would have made much of a difference if you had a different kind of attorney or a different argument. Jane also argued that authorities pegged her from the very start, and they really failed to follow up on other leads. And personally, I was really curious as to why authorities chose not to look into some witness reports that say they saw a man around the same time out there possibly jogging. Why didn't they follow up on any of that stuff?
Well, according to Matt Troiano, who was the legal consultant that we talked to, he felt after looking at many of the documents that this was a matter of tunnel vision. I mean, and you can kind of understand in the sense that if you truly believe as investigators that there's blood in the bedroom and that he was killed in the bedroom, then you're wasting time chasing down witnesses who say they saw a jogger since you don't believe he was out jogging, but they should have.
And also some of the descriptions didn't exactly match Bob. The wrong age, the wrong weight. So yes, a jogger in the area in around the correct time. From the investigator's standpoint, well, the other thing seems like a more viable explanation of what happened because these people didn't quite describe Bob to a T.
I mean, you would think, considering the area, how rural it is, there aren't a ton of people out jogging. And we do know that eyewitnesses sometimes could be not great with the details. You know, it's a good possibility it was him.
Yeah, and it could raise reasonable doubt, even if the person didn't match.
Yeah. So in 2015, though, Jane had a breakthrough in her case when a judge granted her motion to get DNA testing done on several items that had not been tested back in 2000, including the rope around Bob's neck, his fingernail clippings, his clothes. How rare is it for a judge to approve this kind of DNA testing?
According to Matthew Troiano, it's really rare. It's hard. I think it's going to get more and more common as tests become more valuable, I think, but it is very difficult. It's expensive. And so it was very, very lucky for Jane in this case. And it really was what turned this case around.
And when the court did grant that, that was right before an innocence group got involved. So even more unusual that it was based on Jane's filings at that point.
Jane that did it. Whenever anybody asks, really, how did Jane get out? I'm always saying, Jane. Yes, Jane was helped by an Innocence Project, but she was the one who really got the ball rolling. She was the one who got the permission to do the testing, and it made a huge difference in this case.
So this testing changes the course of the case because when they look at the rope and they look under the fingernails, they find foreign male DNA. But just as important is what they don't find, which is Jane's DNA is not there.
So Jane's appellate team also raises the issue of how the sheriff's department originally handled the evidence. I want to play a clip from the broadcast of Nathan Lentz, a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, reviewing a photo of investigators at the original crime scene.
This one is hard to even look at. You have an investigator who definitely should know better, handling murder evidence with his bare hands. In addition to obviously depositing his own DNA all around this crime scene, he's also risking transferring evidence from among the various spots that he's collecting.
I gasped when I saw that picture. When this case was first investigated, was that normal for authorities to handle evidence like that?
I'm kicking myself. I've got to be honest. I saw those pictures back then and didn't realize that at the very least, it reflects kind of a laxness in standards in the sense that, you're touching evidence with your bare fingers. And if anybody should know, it would be a criminalist. You look at it now and it's shocking.
Other investigators had gloves on.
They did.
Some did, some didn't.
Look, investigators are human.
And maybe he wasn't the one actually swabbing, but, who knows what was going through his mind.
All it takes is that one photo to make you question the entire way the crime scene was handled. So in 2020, Jane's appellate team presented its findings, and the state requested that Jane's murder conviction be overturned.
The state asked it.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I said this was an emotional roller coaster to watch because you're like, oh, that's great. And then only 3 months later, the DA decided to retry her. A judge ruled that a new trial could go ahead, but that certain evidence presented in her original trial would not be admissible. At this time, I'm wondering what Jane was feeling because she talks in the hour about essentially just losing her faith in the justice system.
I don't think anybody can actually say what she was feeling, but you can imagine. This was a woman who had fought so hard to get to that point. She is out in 2020. She had been out because of COVID, so she has a taste of freedom. She's finally seen like an end after fighting so long. Think about it. It's like, nearly 20 years. And then they decide they're going to retry her. And to go through a trial again, I mean, I don't think anybody can imagine what had to be going through that woman's head and heart.
Mm-hmm. Back on the emotional roller coaster, the prosecution ultimately decided that there was not sufficient evidence for them to show proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a new trial and requested the court dismiss the charges. Jane's case was dismissed without prejudice. But what exactly does that mean?
Okay, so when you hear without prejudice, that sounds good. And it is. It means that all the charges against her are dropped. But without prejudice means that if somehow new evidence came up, very strong evidence, obviously, that she was involved, they could refile. It's not likely to ever happen, but she has no charges against her. She's as if she had never been charged with murder.
Did Jane ever talk about the loss of her husband? I know this hour was about her fight for freedom, but I kept on also thinking, boy, did she even get a chance to grieve?
I remember her talking about that she never did, because think how quickly she was charged. She never did. And, all of a sudden then she's in a fight for her life. So, there are so many reasons to avoid a wrongful conviction or a questionable conviction. And that's one of them.
Yeah. What's next for Jane?
She works with trying to help women in prison. That's sort of become her focus, is working with wrongful conviction groups as well as groups just helping women in prison and then women when they get out of prison.
I mean, she had always been in the healthcare field. That's what she was in before she was charged and convicted. And so it fits with that. But I can't help but be overwhelmed with sadness over this, of what everyone in that family lost, with the loss of Bob and then this prosecution, a family was destroyed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I remain so, because we can see in the hour that she's not close with her sons. She is close with her daughter.
One son has since passed away, and the other son has not spoken publicly, but has indicated through filings that he believes that she was involved in his father's death. And so, yes, this is a family divided, and it's heartbreaking.
Biggest takeaways from this case? Ruth, I'll start with you.
As Erin had said, it's a cautionary tale, and it's always easier looking back. But you almost have to approach cases thinking, okay, when people look back at this, what should we be careful about? It's a lesson for defense attorneys, for prosecutors, crime scene investigators, for everybody on all sides.
And reporters. Question. I think to question more.
Well, it's an amazing hour, and I was absolutely riveted because there are so many twists and turns, and still there's an unsolved murder out there, Erin, Ruth, thank you so much for joining me again.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.
You can join us next Tuesday for another post-mortem and watch 48 Hours. Of course, it's Saturdays, 10, 9 Central on CBS and streaming on Paramount+. And if you're liking the show, please rate and review 48 Hours on Apple Podcasts and follow 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen ad-free on the Amazon Music and Wondery app or with a 48 Hours Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts.